If you have children in school, get them out. The system is failing them. I'm not putting up with the school system because, quite frankly, they're a disgrace. So I think it's time to homeschool them. It's not just that the schools are overcrowded and underfunded. It's that the teachers are overworked and underpaid. And the curriculum is outdated and doesn't reflect the needs of 21st century students. So if you're considering homeschooling, I say go for it. It's the best decision you'll ever make for your children. But what matters more, your job or your children? Of course, your kids are the most important thing. If you have to leave your job to homeschool them, do it. I want to draw attention to the Tavistock Institute and its work on social engineering. I believe schools are part of a larger plan to control and manipulate the population. If you're unfamiliar with the Tavistock Institute, it's a British think tank founded in 1946. Its original purpose was to study the psychological effects of World War II on soldiers. But it has since evolved into a global organization specializing in mind control and social engineering. Some of the most notable Tavistockians are: Dr. Lang is one of the most controversial and influential psychiatrists of the 20th century and a strong advocate for anti-psychiatry and depathologizing mental illness. John Bowlby was a British psychologist who developed attachment theory, now considered a cornerstone of modern psychology. Dennis Shirley was a leading educational researcher who critiqued traditional education models and argued for more child-centered approaches. Peter Breggin is a psychiatrist known for his work on the dangers of psychiatric drugs, particularly antidepressants and stimulants. Many other Tavistockians have significantly contributed to fields such as psychology, sociology, anthropology, and education. The Tavistock Institute has been involved in some pretty shady stuff over the years. They've been linked to mind control, social engineering, and even the assassination of JFK. If you're not familiar with the Tavistock Institute, I highly recommend doing some research on them. They are a very sinister organization with a lot of power and influence. Russell Marden Viner, FRACPFRCPCHFRCPCBE, born 1963, is an Australian-British paediatrician, data scientist, policy researcher and professor of adolescent health at the UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health. He is an expert on child and adolescent health in the UK and internationally and is an example of someone causing great harm to children. He is experimenting on them with drugs, and he is also working with the government to allow this to happen. It is not something that should be happening and needs to stop. Perhaps less well known is that Hampstead Heath is also a significant centre for outdoor swimming, as well as a hotspot for outdoor sex. Hampstead Heath is also a significant centre for outdoor swimming. Options include Parliament Hill Lido, the Mixed Pond, the Ladies' Pond, and the Men's Pond. There are also numerous secluded spots popular for sunbathing and picnicking and several children's playgrounds. Hampstead Heath is a beautiful place, and it's a shame that it's being used for activities that could potentially harm children. But if I get a professional babysitting service and the person that turns up is Janet, who's 6'2" with stubble and a man, my daughter and I will not be happy. I'll fear she will be traumatized. I don't think that's unreasonable, and I certainly don't think it's bigoted. I will end this with a story because it goes back to when I was in the 6th form in school, waiting for my levels results and seeing what university place had been prosperous. So there was a girl who came out as gay. And at the time, people didn't talk about it as much as they do now. And she had severe mental health problems related to being closeted, unable to come out fully or whatever the case may have been at school. Anyway, she went to university. We all did different things, and I ran into her at a nightclub. And she was with an attractive woman, and they were clearly on a date. But anyway, I went over to say hello, and the girl I'd known before came out as gay. She turned to me and said, "Do you remember when we used to be friends?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, now I'm transgender, so you're not allowed to talk to me anymore because you might make me feel uncomfortable by misgendering me." And that stuck with me because it was the first time I'd ever encountered somebody who had transitioned from one gender to another. And it seemed so ridiculous to me that this person who I had known for years, who was now a different gender, was telling me that I couldn't talk to her anymore. And I think that's where many people get confused. They think that if somebody is transgender, you have to change how you interact with them and tiptoe around them all the time. And I think the line needs to be drawn when somebody's biological sex does not align with their gender identity. But if somebody is born female and many like them identify as male, I don't believe that we should change our pronouns or how we interact with them. Because at the end of the day, they're still a woman. Because at the end of the day, we need to remember that biological sex does exist and that there are only two genders. Male and female. Anything else is just a social construct. And I think that's where the line needs to be drawn. We shouldn't start calling people by pronouns they don't identify with. And we shouldn't start using made-up words like they or zia just because somebody is transgender. We must remember that there are only two genders, male and female. And anything else is just a social construct. But I think it's vital that we also empathize with people going through these things. Because it can't be easy, we should try to understand why they're doing it. And if we can do that, maybe we can start a sensible conversation about this issue. When it comes to the topic of single-sex education, it's a controversial one. People have strong opinions on both sides, and there is no clear consensus. Some argue that single-sex education is beneficial because it allows students to focus on their studies without the distractions of the opposite sex. Some argue that single-sex education is detrimental because it perpetuates gender stereotypes and creates an environment where students don't learn how to interact with members of the opposite sex. I think there are pros and cons to both sides of the argument. And I think it ultimately comes down to personal preference. For example, some people believe boys learn better in an all-boys classroom while girls learn better in an all-girls classroom. And while I think there is some truth to that, I also think it's important for boys and girls to learn together in a co-ed environment. Because at the end of the day, we will have to interact with members of the opposite sex in the real world. However, I can see how single-sex education might not be beneficial for everyone. For example, some people might feel isolated from members of the opposite sex. And I think it's important to remember that everyone is not the same. So, what works for one person might not work for another person. I believe that single-sex education is a personal preference and that there are pros and cons to both sides of the argument. And I think it's important to remember that not everyone is the same. So what works for one person might not work for another person. So, in conclusion, there are pros and cons to both sides of the single-sex education debate. And I believe that it is a personal preference. Click the like button if you enjoyed reading this article. And please share it with others who might find it interesting. Also, subscribe to my channel if you want to receive notifications when I post new videos. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope this was helpful.